Inside the silent chapel, where everyone expected a final farewell, unexpected details turned Charlie Kirk's funeral into a mystery. A faint mark on the coffin, a dog desperately scratching, and an unfinished letter. Each fragment whispered of secrets buried too deep, leaving the world unsettled and craving answers. That morning, a gray sky cast its shadow over the narrow street leading to the church where Charlie Kirk's funeral was to be held. The air outside was thick, heavy, almost like a warning that this would not be an ordinary farewell. Two opposing crowds pressed against the police barricades. On one side, devoted followers dressed in dark coats with Kirk's action insignia pinned to their chests, their solemn eyes burning with the need to defend the legacy of the man they revered. On the other side, critics holding high placards accusing him of hypocrisy, betrayal, and worse. Every whisper, every shout collided, creating a strange chorus, part prayer, part condemnation. Reporters lined the barricades, earpieces in place, cameras fixed on the church doors. They weren't there just to report. They were waiting, anticipating a spark that would ignite the moment into something unforgettable. That tension spread like wildfire, creeping into every glance, every breath from the crowd. Everyone sensed something was about to happen, but no one dared to guess what it might be. Then the black SUVs rolled in, slowly, deliberately. The tinted windows shielded the faces inside, feeding the crowd's hunger for answers. "Is that his wife?" someone whispered. "Or his parents?" another voice pressed. Hundreds of phones shot into the air, each frame instantly transmitted to millions unable to attend. And when the coffin appeared, draped in immaculate white cloth, the noise fell silent. But the silence was not reverence, it was suspicion. The coffin was carried by a group guarded with unusual precision, every step rehearsed, every movement calculated. It felt less like protection and more like choreography, a performance designed as much to conceal as to honor. In that moment, the crowd seemed to understand instinctively. This was no ordinary ceremony. Behind the chapel doors, something else was waiting to be revealed. A funeral is meant to close a chapter, to draw the line beneath a life lived. But from the very first moments of that morning, it was clear this one was different. The silence was too heavy, the stares too sharp, the atmosphere too charged. What was supposed to be a goodbye was transforming, piece by piece, into a mystery. And as the coffin disappeared into the shadows of the church, a single question hovered in the air, an unspoken truth pressing against every heart present. What secret was being buried beneath the prayers and the watchful eyes? The door of the black SUV opened, and the air seemed to freeze. First, his wife stepped out. Her hair fell across her face, her dark sunglasses concealing her eyes, but her trembling hand betrayed everything. Clutched tightly in her palm was the folded funeral program, the edges crumpled from her grip. On her finger, the wedding ring spun endlessly, as if the nervous motion could ward off the fear pressing in on her. Behind her, Kirk's parents emerged. Age and grief had already bent their posture. His father kept one hand firmly on the car door, as though letting go meant accepting a truth he could not face. His mother's gaze swept over the crowd, not with anger, but with dread, the look of someone burdened by knowledge too heavy to speak aloud. Murmurs followed her every step, and unease spread like wildfire. The cameras captured every haunting detail. The wife's lips pressed so tightly they turned pale, the father's trembling hand clinging to the door, the mother's flickering eyes. This was not the image of a family simply in mourning. It was the image of people carrying a weight far beyond grief. Inside the chapel, they walked slowly down the aisle. Yet the mourners' eyes did not follow the coffin at the front, but the heavy, deliberate steps of the family. The atmosphere thickened until it felt suffocating. No one dared to breathe too loudly, as if even the faintest sound might shatter the fragile veil of tension cloaking the room. One relative could not contain herself, breaking into tears with a sudden sob that echoed in the silence. Another clenched his fists, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed not on the coffin, but on the rows of political figures seated ahead. Division, confrontation, and accusation, all silently alive in that chapel. Then came the moment that silenced everything further. The father bent forward, burying his face in his hands, and whispered something only his family could hear. The wife's face blanched instantly, her reaction unmistakable. It was not comfort. It was shock. And in that brief exchange, the chapel quivered with a revelation unspoken. The silence that followed was not solemn, it was electric, unnerving, as though everyone present had just witnessed the edge of a secret tearing through the air, too fragile and too dangerous to name. As the pallbearers carried the coffin inside, the chapel seemed to hold its breath. Draped in an immaculate white cloth, the coffin glowed faintly beneath the dim church lights. Yet that purity only heightened the sense that something was wrong. Every step of the bearers was slow, deliberate, and unnervingly precise, as if they were performing a ritual rehearsed many times before. It felt more staged than solemn. The crowd watched in silence, but not a silence of reverence. It was a silence of doubt, a silence that whispered of secrets being concealed. When the coffin was lowered onto the stand, the sharp thud of wood striking stone reverberated unnaturally, jolting several mourners. Some clutched their chests, others turned their faces away, as though the sound had stirred a buried anxiety already present in the room. Then came the moment that shifted everything. As the white cloth was adjusted, a faint reflection glimmered off the polished surface of the wood. For the briefest instant, a small mark was revealed, subtle but undeniably deliberate. Those seated closest leaned forward, squinting. A woman covered her mouth, eyes wide with shock. Whispers rippled outward like waves through the pews, swelling with every repetition. The cameras, restricted from capturing close-ups, missed the detail, leaving only speculation in its wake. Was it a symbol, a name, or a message etched before the coffin was sealed? No one could say for certain, but the unease it unleashed was undeniable. The priest urged the congregation to return their focus to prayer, yet attention had already shifted, carried elsewhere by curiosity and dread. And then, the tension broke into something sharper. The family's dog, quietly brought inside earlier, suddenly lunged forward. Pulling free from its handler, it bolted down the aisle. Gasps filled the room as the animal leapt onto the coffin, paws pressing against the shroud. For a suspended moment, time seemed to freeze. Then came the sound, the frantic scrape of claws on wood, raw and grating, echoing against the walls of the chapel. The dog whined, pawing furiously at one end of the coffin, as though trying to reach something hidden within. Its cries were not merely grief, they carried an urgency, a desperate insistence that chilled everyone present. Security rushed forward, attempting to restrain the animal, but their struggle only deepened the tension. Mourners exchanged uneasy glances, fear flickering in their eyes. This was no simple farewell. The coffin, meant to conceal death, had instead become the center of suspicion, transformed into a vessel of unanswered questions. And with every scrape of the dog's claws, the unspoken truth seemed closer to clawing its way into the open. When the dog was finally taken outside, the chapel sank into an uneasy silence. The priest quickly invited the first speaker to the podium. It was a longtime colleague of Charlie Kirk, his face pale, his hands trembling as he opened a small notebook. At first, his voice carried the familiar cadence of grief, recounting victories and triumphs Kirk had achieved. It sounded like a standard eulogy, a solemn farewell to a fallen figure. But then the tone began to shift. Each memory recounted carried not only pride, but a cost. Sleepless nights, fractured friendships, decisions that left scars no one wanted to acknowledge. Murmurs spread across the congregation. Was this a tribute or an indictment? The atmosphere grew heavier when a family member suddenly broke down, rushing forward without warning. Unscripted, unpolished, her voice cracked with raw pain as she spoke of midnight arguments, broken promises, and burdens carried in silence. Her words were jagged, almost unbearable in their honesty. The chapel sat frozen, suspended between empathy and discomfort. The priest tried to intervene, to restore order, but her grief overpowered his calm authority. And just as the room threatened to settle, another disruption erupted. From the back, a man rose to his feet, uninvited. His voice boomed through the chamber, accusing Kirk not only of political betrayal, but personal ones. Gasps rippled like thunder. Security reacted instantly, dragging him away, yet the damage was done. The illusion of unity was gone, shattered beyond repair. Then an even stranger moment unfolded. A close family friend stepped forward, clutching a folded envelope. Her hands shook as she explained that the letter had been discovered among Kirk's belongings, dated during his final weeks. Instantly, the entire chapel leaned forward, anticipation crackling through the air. The handwriting was hurried, uneven. Each passage was read in broken fragments, as though the letter itself resisted being voiced. The words spoke of silent burdens, decisions made in shadows, and, most haunting of all, one line that struck like a thunderclap. "There are truths I could never speak while alive." The phrase fell into the room like a stone sinking into water. Some bowed their heads, others exchanged alarmed glances. It was impossible to ignore. What began as a eulogy had transformed into something else entirely, a reckoning. And the letter was no longer just paper. It was a key, a clue pointing toward a hidden door. Yet no one knew what lay beyond that door. The only certainty was the silence that followed, dense, suffocating, and filled with questions that no prayer could answer. After the letter was read, the atmosphere inside the chapel seemed frozen. No one dared to breathe too loudly, as if even the smallest sound might shatter the crushing silence pressing down on everyone. All eyes turned to the front pew, where Charlie Kirk's father had sat motionless since the beginning of the service. His head hung low, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. And then, slowly, he rose to his feet. The movement was heavy, each step a battle against his own frailty. The wooden pew groaned as he pulled himself away, and instantly, the entire room fell silent. No one had expected him to speak. The elderly father walked forward, shoulders hunched, eyes red and raw. When his voice emerged, it was not strong, it trembled, but it carried through the chapel with such piercing clarity that no one could ignore it. He did not speak of victories. He did not recall legacies polished by headlines. Instead, he spoke of the long nights when he begged his son to choose a gentler path, of conversations that ended unfinished, of prayers unanswered. His voice cracked, his words broke apart, but the rawness made them unbearably real. "We were not always together," he said, "and there are things I learned only too late." The words landed like stones, and the room seemed to stop breathing. No one needed to ask. The implication was undeniable. Charlie Kirk had carried secrets to his grave, secrets even his closest kin never fully knew. From her seat, the mother reached out instinctively as if to stop him, but he continued. His hand gripped the edge of the lectern, his knuckles bone white, his gaze sweeping across the congregation. "The truth will come out," he declared, his voice hoarse but resolute, "whether through us or through history yet unwritten." The words reverberated, shaking the room like a tremor. Some mourners lowered their heads, unable to meet each other's eyes. Others leaned forward, desperate for more, their anticipation etched into their faces. But the father did not continue. He stepped back, leaving behind a silence more haunting than any revelation. In that moment, the funeral ceased to be a farewell. It had become testimony, an anguished confession, and a chilling promise that the darkness surrounding Charlie Kirk's life was far from closed. After the father stepped back, the room did not regain its calm. Instead, it vibrated with unease. Eyes no longer lingered on the coffin or the hymns echoing through the chapel, but turned toward the rows of pews flanking either side. There, the divide was plain to see, like a fault line running down the center of the nation. On one side sat Kirk's closest allies, conservative politicians in black suits, their faces stern, their expressions carefully measured. They sat upright, every movement deliberate, as though performing for the cameras. On the other side were critics, journalists, and even open rivals of Kirk. They had not come out of loyalty, but out of obligation or curiosity. Their very presence ignited murmurs, sharp glances, and restrained outrage. When a familiar senator entered, the atmosphere grew knife-edged. Some nodded in recognition, others clenched their jaws, their eyes flashing with irritation. Cameras swung quickly, capturing every frown, every tilt of the head, turning the chapel into a layered political stage. Caught in the middle were the undecided. They had once supported Kirk, but had drifted away in recent years. Now they sat visibly conflicted, their faces etched with hesitation, torn between genuine grief and the political burden of being seen here. A former aide tapped nervously on the wooden pew, each soft knock echoing like the anxious rhythm of a restless heart. The silence inside was no longer one of reverence. It was the silence of adversaries forced into proximity, the hush of enemies cloaked in solemn ritual. No words were exchanged, no nods of acknowledgement, only suspicion, calculation, and the awareness that every reaction was being recorded. This was no longer a funeral. It had become a battlefield in disguise, where grief was eclipsed by power struggles, and every gaze cut through the air like a blade aimed at the unresolved mysteries that hung heavy above the coffin.